Okay, let us see now the main parts of a poem. The main parts of a poem, we have different main parts. Almost they are like 7 or 8. Let us see one after another. This is just a creativity out of creativity, and this is just a flower. But I'm going to paste around the main parts of a poem. Assuming this is a poem, and this now a poem flower, and then we paste the main parts. Now the first part of a poem, it is a picture. This, it might look not that much very common, but we have what we call a picture, you can see. So a picture is the main part of a poem. It's very, very important. Most of the poet includes pictures with the poems. I mean, a good example is in the Song of Lawino and Song of Okol, whereby in the poem, the woman with whom I share my husband, Lawino, I mean Okot Pibitek, used a female chicken. He used a hen to display or to reveal the behaviors or the way Clementine looks like. So you can see pictures are very, very important. So sometimes we see poems with the pictures. So if you see that, please know that it's the main part of a poem. That is the first part. The second part of a poem is the title. Others, they call it the name of a poem. The title, of course, it helps to communicate or to give the clue to the reader on what the poem is about. Titles are very important. For example, we have different titles. For example, we have a poem called A Freedom Song by Marjorie Orothi. But also we have a poem called the Sunrise by Joan Maikusa. But we have also the Song of Lawino by Okot P. Bitek. All those are titles. But titles, they help the reader at least to get the meaning, at least to get the clue of what the poem may be about or might be about. And sometimes we are advised not to rely on the titles, because some of the titles or names of the poems are ironic. For example, take an example of the poem Building the Nation. Building the Nation by Henry Barrow. If you read that poem, you will find there is nothing like building the nation. So you find, so sometimes if you rely much on the title, it might mislead the reader. So, but it's very important not to take for granted. You need to consider the title of a poem. We have the title of the poem, for example, Sunrise, which is a symbolic title. Sunrise symbolizing the beginning of a day. The beginning of a day, sunrise. But also we have a poem like A Freedom Song, I said. A freedom song, which is not directly what important, it does not reflect exactly what is inside. So the content and the title, you might find somehow it's like ironic. It's different from what is expressed in a poem. For example, A Freedom Song, nothing like a freedom in that poem. If you read, there is nothing like a freedom, but it talks, maybe it suggests on the ways of how to free the child, especially the female child. So it's very important to consider the title, which is the main part also for a poem, but not to over rely on a title. Those are the two main parts. Of course, we have another part, which is the poet, So we can say this is number 1, this is number 2, the second part, this is the third part. So we have the first part, the second part, and the third part. So the third part is called the author or the poet or the poetess. Now here it varies. Mostly author is a general term. The author is the general term for a person who writes literary work, especially novels, plays, sometimes poems. But in poetry, we call the person who writes poems or who composes poems or who create poems is called a poet, if it's a male person. But if it's a female person, we call her a poetess. And a good example of a male poet is like Henry Sanga myself. I have a poem called High Five. Maybe next lesson we can go through High Five. But also we have famous poets like Joani Mwaikusa. Joani Mwaikusa is a poet. We have also Isaac Mruma is a poet. We have Agustino Neto, the first president of Angola, also is a poet. But also we have female poets, those who write poems but from the other gender, female. These we call them poetess. For example, Marjorie Oruthi Makigoe from the poem A Freedom Song. A Freedom Song is written by Marjorie Oruthi, is a female writer who wrote A Freedom Song. So this is a very important part. These are very important, and please, there are other people who neglect, who take this for granted. Please make sure, before you analyze a poem, make sure you know who is a poet, who is the writer of that poem, who composed that poem. It's like now, let me give an example. If you speak of a song sung by Diamond or by Zuchu, so without mentioning the name of Zuchu, then it will be plagiarism. You need to acknowledge the one who composed. I have also songs like the one we sang with the Christina Shushu is called Nipe Ni Muda. Now Nipe Ni Muda, if you say Nipe Ni Muda, then you must talk about Henry Sanga. Or if we take like a famous song like Secret Agenda by Rosie Muhando. So Rosie Muhando is a poetess. Rosie Muhando is a poetess, is an artist, but she's a poetess because that songs are poems. We have famous songs like Shusha Nyavu by Christina Shusho. Many songs, and so those songs are also poems. So we can categorize songs also in poems because they have the same structure, they use sounds, and also they choose words carefully. So we call a person who writes a poem is a poet, and a poet, this is another very important part when it comes to poetry. Another important part of a poem or element of a poem is the verse. The verse. So we can put it here. This one we can say it's number 4. Number 4. So this is also a very important. Of course, a verse is called a line. A line. Now, what is a verse? A verse is a single line in a poem. Later, I will demonstrate how a verse looks like. Of course, it gives a structure to poetry form, a verse. Other they use lines. Now, it's very important to note that in poetry or in poems, talking about poems, we talk about verses, we talk about lines, and we don't talk about sentences. But when it comes to other literary genres, prose, narratives, we talk about sentences, but here we talk about verses. A verse can have the punctuation. Sometimes verses, they don't have punctuation, but we mean a single line. Group of verses, they form stanza, a stanza, or other they call it a paragraph. But I would prefer to call it a stanza because paragraph consists of different sentences. But here a stanza consists of lines, which are not necessary to be sentences. So that's a verse. A verse does not mean a long line. No, a verse can be even a single word. For example, a poem Echoes by Kundi Faraja. It starts with a word me, and the me is considered as a verse. So a verse can be one word, can be 2 words, or it differs in length. Can be a long sentence, but it's a verse. So not necessarily to be a very long or a very long line. No, it can be even a 1-word verse. This is also a very important item to be considered when we talk about the main parts of a poem. It's very important to understand this. Another part which is very important to consider is a stanza. So this is be the 5th part. Stanza. A stanza. Now, a stanza, we say group of lines. Group of lines. And group of lines is made up of, different verses, they make a stanza. So a stanza is a group of lines. But sometimes a stanza not necessarily to be group of lines. It can be one line. A single line can make a stanza. A good example of this poem called the Hollow Heads. Hollow Heads by Joani Mwaikusa. In a poem Hollow Heads, we have the last stanza, which consists of a single verse, and the verse is and I will fight to the last cell. So that's an example of a stanza which is made up of a single line or verse. So a stanza not necessarily to be group of lines. Sometimes it can be a single line made up of one word, or of two words, or three, or five. So that is what we call a stanza. We can check some, for example, a poem Sunrise, which is a sonnet, is made up of one stanza. So it's made up of one stanza which consists of several verses. But also we have a poem like A Freedom Song, made up of different stanzas. We have a poem like You Are Lost by Isaac Mruma, made up of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 stanzas, and so on and so forth. So stanza is also very, very important. Now we have the gap between the stanzas, which is called space. Space. Now a space mostly it separates the stanzas. Between the stanzas we have spaces. So this is, we can call it number 5 or 4, sorry. Can use the blue one to make it clear the same, and this will be the 6th element. Space is very, very also important, especially when you ask how many stanzas are there in a poem. Please, traditionally you have to consider space, and space is a gap between the stanzas. So for today, I think tried my best, at least in identifying this. Now what is next? Let us have a poem and then identify all these main parts of our poem through using a poem, the actual poem. And my favorite poem, it can be, please let us see together.